Welcome to Storybite, where we dig into old tales, ancient myths and forgotten folklore to uncover the heart of storytelling. I'm Lynx, author, indie dev and your friendly literary archaeologist. Today we're cracking open a story that's more than what it seems, layered with meaning, legacy and lessons for writers and readers alike. Join me now as we get ready to dissect
The Welsh Fairies Hold a Meeting.
If you love stories with teeth, tales with twists, or just a good old-fashioned folklore with a deeper bite, tap like, hit subscribe and join me for a new Storybite every Monday. In the ancient Cymric gatherings, the druids, poets, prophets, seers and singers all had a part. The one most honoured as the president of the meeting was crowned and garlanded, and then he was led in honour and sat in a chair of state. They call this great occasion an Eisteddfod, or sitting, after the Cymric word meaning a chair. All over the world, the Welsh folks, who do so passionately love music, poetry and their own grand language, hold the Eisteddfod at regular intervals. Thus they renew their love for the fatherland and what they have received long ago from their ancestors. Now it happens that the fairies in every land usually follow the customs of the mortals amongst whom they live. The Swiss, the Dutch, the Belgian and the Japanese and Korean fairies, as we all know, although they are much alike in things, are as different from each other as the countries in which they live and play. So when the Welsh fairies all met together, they resolved to have songs and harp music and make the piper play his tunes, just as in the Eisteddfod. The Cymric fairies of our days have many troubles to complain of. They were disgusted with so much coal smoke, the poisoning of the air by chemical fumes, and the blackening of the landscape by so many factory chimneys. They had other grievances also. Fairy tales are usually small stories. One child, one wish, one act of magic. But what if all the fairies in a country held a summit? What if they came not to charm, but to debate, to file complaints, to protest coal smoke, to blacklist rude spirits? That is exactly what happens in The Welsh Fairies Hold a Meeting, a satirical, poetic and brilliantly structured fairy tale where folklore becomes folklore about itself. This isn't just a gathering of magical beings, it's a Cymric Eisteddfod in miniature, where the fairies, like the Welsh, come together to preserve tradition, regulate mischief and defend joy. And it all starts with Queen Mab and Puck issuing invitations. Section 1. The Fairy
Eisteddfod.
So the Queen Mab, who had a Welsh name, and another fairy called Puca, or in English King Puck, sent out invitations into every part of Wales for a gathering on the hills near a great rock called Dinas Seat. This is a rocky chair formed by nature. They also included in their call those parts of Western and South England such are still Welsh and spiritually almost a part of Wales. In fact, Cornwall was the old land in which the Cymry first landed when coming over from the sea. The meeting was to be held on a moonlit night and far away from any houses, lest the merrymaking, dancing and singing of the fairies should keep the farmers awake. This is something of which the yokels, or the men of the plough, often complained. They could not sleep while the fairies were having their parties. In Old Welsh tradition, a great gathering of poets, singers, prophets and bards was called Eisteddfod, a sitting. The greatest among them would be crowned and honoured in a ceremonial chair. It was celebration, debate, unity, culture held aloft. And fairies, they mirror us. So Queen Mab, who's very Welsh by the way, and King Puck issue an invitation. All the fairies of Wales, and even the Welsh bits of England and Cornwall are to gather under moonlight near Dinas Seat for a Fairy Eisteddfod of their own. It's structured, formal, political, but also hilarious, because unlike the humans, the fairies have opinions about everything, from chimney smoke to bad mermaids to shrieking changeling babies. Section 2. Guest list and the band list. Now, among the Welsh fairies of every sort, size, dress and behaviour, some were good, but others were bad. But most of them were only full of fun and mischief. Chief of those was the lively little fellow Puck, who lived in Pumpuka, that is Puck Valley, in Breconshire. Now, it had been an old custom which had come down from the days of the cavemen, that when anyone's life ended, the people, friends and relatives sat up all night with the body. This custom arose first with the idea of protection against wild beasts, and later from insult of enemies. This is called a wake. The watchers wept and wailed at first, and then fell to eating and drinking. Sometimes they got to be very lively. The young folks even looked on a wake after the first hour or two as fine fun. Strong liquor was too plentiful, and it often happened that quarrels broke out. When heads were thus fuddled, men saw, or thought they saw, many uncanny things, like leather birds, cave eagles, and the like. But all these fantastic things and creatures, such as foolish people talk about, with which they frighten children, such as corpse candles, demons, and imps, were ruled out and not invited to the fairy meeting. Some other objects, which ignorant folk believed in, were not to be allowed in the company. The doorkeeper was notified not to admit the eagles of darkness that live in the cave which is never lighted, or the weird featherless bird of leather from the land of illusion and fantasy that brushes its wing against windows when a funeral is soon to take place, or the greedy dog with silver eyes. None of these would be permitted to show themselves, even if they came and tried to get in. Some other creatures not recognised in the good society of fairyland were also barred out. To this gathering only the bright and lively fairies were welcome. Some of the best natured among the big creatures, and especially giants and dragons, might pay a visit, if they wanted to do so. But all the bad ones, such as lake hags, wraiths, sellers of liquids for wakes, who made men drunk, and all who, under the guise of fairies, were only agents for undertakers, were ruled out. The night dogs, the wicked hunter Annam, the monster Avang, Cadwallader's goats, and various cruel goblins and ogres living in the ponds that pulled cattle down to eat them up, and the immodest mermaids, whose bad behaviour was so well known, were crossed off the list of invitations. No ugly brats, such as wicked fairies with the habit of putting in cradles of mortal mothers when they stole away their babies, were allowed to be present, even if they should come with their mothers. This was all to be perfectly respectable company, and no bawling, squealing, crying, or blubbering was permitted. Keeping, and the list is long. Coal smoke, denounced. Factory fumes, uninvited. Weird undead cave eagles, denied entry. Leather birds that tap on windows before death, banned. Silver-eyed demon dogs, hard pass. Even the bad mermaids, known for their scandalous behaviour, they are scratched off. Puck and Marb want this gathering to be festive, orderly, and frankly respectable. So anything grim or ghostly, goblinish or drunk, gets kicked off the invite list. It's like a high society gala with a magical velvet ropes. Only the bright and lively fairies get to come. Giants and dragons? Maybe, if they behave. And the lake hags and changeling swapping trolls? Get thee gone. Section 3. Fairy fashion and social satire. When they had all gathered together in the evening hour, there was seen, in the moonlight, the funniest lot of creatures that one can imagine, but all were neatly dressed and well behaved. Quite a number of the famous fair family that moved only in the best society of fairyland, fathers, mothers, cousins, uncles and aunts were on hand. In fact, some of them had thought it was to be awake, and were ready for whatever might turn up, whether solemn or frivolous. They were dressed in varied costume. Queen Mab, who above all else was a Welsh fairy, and whose name was, as everyone knows, who talks Cymric, suggested her extreme youth and lively disposition, was present in all her glory. When they saw her, several learned fairies who had come a distance fell in once into conversation on the subject. One marked, how would the Queen like to add another syllable to her name? Maybe we should call her Mabgath, which means kitten. Well, not so bad. However, because many mortal daddies have a daughter, let's call her Kitten in a term of affection with them, and because little girls never seem to be offended by that. Oh, suppose that in talking to each other we call our queen Mabgar. What then? Asked another with a roguish twinkle in his eye. It depends on how you use it, said a wise one dryly. This fairy was a stickler for the correct use of every word. If you mean babyish or childish, she or her friends might demur. But if you use the term love of children, what better name for a fairy queen? None, there could not be any, they shouted all at once. But let's ask our friend the harper. Oh, a bit of an aside here. We have a feline war going on, and you might see Tam Tam, but I'm afraid Nossi and Cyrilla are boycotting anywhere that he is. So I miss my little babies, but they're just eschewing the area right now. So, the fairies arrive, and it is glorious. They come in droves, dancing, riding fireflies, tripping across moonlit flowers, dressed like characters from a Fay Met Gala. Some think it's a wake, others think it's a coronation. Everyone is wearing their best. And then comes the side-eye conversations. What should we call Queen Mab? Mabgath? Mabgar? Does this mean affectionate or childish? Would she be offended if we added a syllable to her name? It's pure social satire. These fairies are delicate wisps of light. They gossip, they critique, they manage their PR. And it's brilliant. Because what are we really seeing here? It's the entire Welsh cultural instinct, poetry, wordplay, diplomacy, expressed through myth. And we're only just now getting to the harvest. Section 4. Who's old and who's wise? Now, such a thing as inquiring into each other's ages was not common in fairyland. Very few ever asked such a question, for it was not considered polite. For, though we hear of ugly fairy brats being put into cradles in place of pretty children, no one ever heard of either fairies being born or their lives ending, or having clocks or watches, or looking to see what time it was. Nor did doctors, or the census clerks, or directory people ever trouble the fairy ladies to ask their age. Occasionally there was one fairy so wise, so learned, and so being able to tell what was going to happen tomorrow or next year, that other fairies looked to them with such respect and awe. Yet these honourables will hardly know what you were talking about if you asked any of them how old they might be, or spoke of old or young. By any chance a fairy did use the word old in talking of their number, it would be for honour or dignity, and they would mean it as a compliment. In fact, the fact was that many of the most lively fairies showed their frivolous disposition at once. These were the kind that, like kittens, cubs, or babies, wanted to play all the time. Yes, every moment. Already hundreds of them were tripping from flower to flower, riding on the backs of fireflies, or harnessing night moths, or any winged creature they could saddle for flight through the air. Or they were waltzing with glowworms, or playing ring round a rosy, or dancing in circles. They could not keep still. Not even one moment. In fact, when a great crowd of the frolicsome creatures got singing together, they made such a noise that a squad of fairy policemen dressed in club moss and armed with flowers were sent to warn them not to raise their voices too high, lest the farmers, especially those with the kinder fairies, should be awakened and feel in bad humour. So the knot of learned fairies had a quiet time to talk, and when able to hear their own words, the harper, who was very learned, asked their questions about Queen Mab as follows. Well, you know the famous children's story in which mortals read about us when they say they enjoy so much. It's called the Mabinogion, that is, the young folks' treasury of Cymric stories. It is well named, said another fairy savant, since Queen Mab is the only fairy that waits on men. She inspires their dreams when these are born in their brains. Now we get to one of my favourite parts of the tale. A group of learned fairies are quietly debating Queen Mab's name, and that turns into a conversation about age, language, and what it means to honour someone. Because in fairyland, no one asks how old you are. It's considered rude, pointless, meaningless. Fairies are ageless, not because they don't grow, but because time works differently in the land of the myths. To be called old isn't an insult, it's a compliment, a mark of respect, a sign that you've danced longer, sung deeper, and lived more. And when the wise old harper speaks, he links Queen Mab's very name to the Mabinogion, the great treasury of Welsh lore. She's not just a party planner, she is the patron saint of imagination. Section 5. When fairies start to gossip. The talk now turned to Puck, who was to be the president of the meeting. They were expecting to show much dignity in his presence, but some feared that he would, as usual, play some pranks. Before he arrived in his chariot, which was drawn by dragonflies, some of the neighbours that lived in the valley nearby chatted about him, until the gossip became quite personal. Just for the fun of it, the amusement of the crowd, they wanted Puck to give off an exhibition, offhand, of his varied accomplishments, for he could beat all rivals in his special variety, or, as musicians say, his repertoire. No, 'twould be too much like a Merry Andrews or a buffoon sideshow, where the folks of all sorts are gathered, such as they have those county fairs where the mortals get up, which are gathered in great crowds. The charge admission is 6pence. I vote no. Well, for the very reason that Puck can beat the rest of us at spells and transformations, I should like to see him do for us as many stunts as he can. I've heard from a mortal named Shakespeare that in one performance Puck could be a horse, a hound, a hog, a bear without any head, and even kindle himself into a fire, while his vocal powers, as we know, are endless. He can neigh, bark, grunt, roar, and even burn up things. Now, I should like to see a fairy that could beat him at tricks. It was Puck himself who told the world that he was in the habit of doing all these things, and I want to see whether or not he was boasting. Tut, don't talk that way about our king, said a fourth fairy. All in all, this was only chaff and fun, for all the fairies were in good humour. They were only talking to fill up the interval until the music began. As the music gets set to begin, the fairies do what fairies do best. They gossip. And the topic? Puck. Their king, their troublemaker, their magical trickster. They want him to do stunts. They want transformations. They want a little Shakespearean mischief. He said he could turn into fire, so let's see it. One fairy calls him a buffoon, another demands a demonstration, a third insists it's all in fun, but the fourth says that's still our king. And there's the brilliant turn. This entire scene is a mirror of human councils, satire panels, and even artist collective. It's chaotic, passionate, affectionate, critical, and democratic. They tease because they love him, but they also hold him to a high standard. And that's Welsh culture all over. Deeply irreverent, but never disrespectful. Section 6. The threat that stopped the show. Now, the canny Welsh fairies had a trick of catching farthings, pennies and sixpence from the folks who have more curiosity in them than even fairies do. These human beings, cunning fellows as they are, let the curtain fall on a show just at the most interesting part, and then they tell you to come the next day and find out what is to happen. Or, as they say in a story paper, to be continued in the next. Or, worse than all, the storyteller stops at some very exciting episode and passes the hat or collection box round to get the copper or silver of his listeners before he will go on. This time, however, it was Puck himself who came forward and declared that, unless every one of the fairies would promise to attend next year's meeting, there would be no music. Now, in a meeting of the Welshry, whether fairy or human, without music is not such a thing to be thought of. So although at first some fairies grumbled and held back, they were quite sulky about it, even muttering other grumpy words. They at all last agreed, and Puck sent for the fiddler to make music for the dance. The end. And then Puck does something shocking. He cancels the music. No tunes, he says, unless everyone promises to attend the next meeting. The fairies gasp. They clutch their pearls, sulk, whisper angrily. No music? Oh, that's blackmail. I flew all the way from Cornwall. But Puck holds the line, because this isn't just a party. It's a cultural act of survival. The fairies, like the company themselves, exist only as long as they gather, as long as they sing and play and dance. If they stop, if they let their meeting fade, then the music dies. So Puck does what every great bard and trickster eventually must. He makes them care. Section 7. What this story is really about. This story isn't just about mischief. It's about memory. It's not about fairy politics. It's about cultural continuity. Every fairy here represents a type of story. A song, a fear, a hope, a protest. And when they gather, when they hold their meeting, they're doing what the Eisteddfod always did. They're renewing what it means to be Welsh. Not by law, but by art. That is the brilliance of this tale. It's a fairy story that doesn't pretend to be historical, but somehow it teaches history better than most textbooks. Because this isn't fantasy escaping reality, it's fantasy protecting it. Last looks, the fairy council that never ends. This tale might sound like a magical party, but it's more like a manifesto, a story about stories, a satire that preserves a people, a council of fairies standing in for a nation's voice. And what is their final demand? That we meet again. Because as long as the fairies gather, the music plays. As long as the stories are told, a people live. And as long as the Welsh remember who they are. No coal smoke, no goblins, no factory fumes or fading memory can take that away. This was the Welsh Fairies Hold a Meeting, and this is your Storybite. I'm Lynx, and now you know. I'll see you in the next video. This one, right here, be a love and click it. It'll get you an invite to the next fairy meeting.